"If you don't marry me, I won't be able to live." She said, rancher letters stay in the heart of the Texas countryside. Jacob lived a quiet life. The ranch was all he knew, and it was all he wanted.
A man of few words, Jacob kept to himself. His days were spent tending to the cattle, fixing fences, and handling whatever tasks the land demanded.
It wasn't a glamorous life, but it was his. There were no distractions, no noise, just the vast, open spaces and the steady rhythm of ranch work. His world was simple, and that was the way he liked it. Jacob wasn't a social man, birth. He had no family left, and the few friends he had were spread far across the state. The closest town was a small place called Liberty Springs, where the people were friendly, but he didn't visit much. The ranch was enough for him, even if it meant being alone. It was early one morning when everything changed. Jacob had just finished his breakfast when he heard the sound of a car engine sputtering in the distance. It was unusual for anyone to drive this far out unless they needed something. He stood at the window for a moment, watching the dust cloud rising as the car struggled up the dirt road. He squinted as the car came closer, realizing it was an old, rusted sedan. It came to a halt just outside his gate. A woman stepped out of the car looking frustrated and tired. She had dark, messy hair that clung to her face, and her clothes were wrinkled from a long journey. She seemed out of place in the vast, open fields, where the only things to be seen for miles were the occasional herd of cattle in the horizon. Despair. She walked up to the gate, hesitating for a moment before knocking on the door. Jacob opened it slowly, curious but not exactly thrilled by the interruption. "Excuse me, sir," she said, her voice shaking just slightly, as if she was trying to hold back tears. I'm in need of some help." "My car broke down, and I don't know where else to turn." Jacob could see the weariness in her eyes. She wasn't asking for much, just a little assistance. He wasn't sure what he could do. The nearest mechanic was a good hour away, and the thought of leaving the ranch for that long didn't sit well with him. But he didn't want to turn her away either. He had seen too many people struggle to ignore it when someone needed help. "Well, I can't fix your car, but I have a spare room," Jacob said, surprising himself with his offer. He wasn't one for making small talk or playing the host, but there was something about her that made him want to help. She looked at him for a moment, as if she couldn't believe her luck. "Oh, thank you," she said, relief flooding her voice. "I just need a place to stay for a night or two, until I can get my car fixed. I don't have much money, but I can help around here." "I'm good with cleaning and cooking." Jacob nodded, though he didn't expect her to actually stick around for long. He had heard promises like that before, people promising to help but never staying. Still, he couldn't leave her stranded out here. "All right, come on in," he said, stepping aside to let her pass. She walked into the small, modest house, looking around at the simplicity of it all. The walls were bare, the furniture worn but functional. There was a small fireplace in the corner, and the kitchen was simple but had everything needed to cook a meal. It wasn't much, but it was home. "I'm Maggie, by the way," she said, turning to face him. "Thank you so much. I'll be out of your hair in no time, I promise." Jacob just nodded, not used to talking much. "I'm Jacob," he replied gruffly. He didn't feel the need to explain anything more about himself. He wasn't one for long conversations. Maggie stayed quietly at first, sitting at the small kitchen table while Jacob went about his business, checking the ranch and making sure everything was in order. He wasn't sure what to make of her. There was a strange tension in the air, a sense of uncertainty that hung between them. She wasn't like anyone he'd known before. She wasn't from the ranching world, and that made him uncomfortable. But at the same time, he couldn't shake the feeling that she needed him. And maybe, just maybe, he could be of some help.
As the hours passed, Maggie began to settle in.
She offered to help with the chores around the ranch, just as she had promised. She was good with the animals, and Jacob found himself a bit impressed. He had expected someone unfamiliar with the ranch life to be clumsy, but Maggie seemed to pick things up quickly. They didn't talk much. The silence between them was heavy, but not uncomfortable. It was the kind of silence that came from two people who were content with just being near each other, without needing to fill every moment with words. That night, Maggie cooked dinner for them both. It wasn't much, just a simple stew made from vegetables she'd found in the pantry and some beef she'd cooked up. But it was filling, and it tasted like comfort. Inspiration. Jacob wasn't used to someone else in the kitchen, but he found that he didn't mind. She moved around with ease, humming softly to herself as she worked. It was nice to have someone else around, someone who wasn't asking for anything other than a place to stay. As they sat down to eat, Jacob couldn't help but notice how different things felt. The house seemed less empty, less lonely, with Maggie there. She wasn't exactly a guest, not in the traditional sense. She was more like a part of the landscape now, something that had always been there, even though it was new. Maggie looked up from her bowl, meeting his gaze for the first time. I'm really grateful, she said quietly. I don't know what I would have done without your help. Jacob gave a small nod, unsure of how to respond. It's nothing, he muttered, focusing on his food. He wasn't used to gratitude, especially not from someone he had just met. But something about her made him feel like he was doing the right thing. And for the first time in a long while, he wasn't sure if he wanted her to leave.
As the days passed, Maggie didn't leave, and neither did Jacob push her away. She helped out more and more around the ranch, and Jacob found himself relying on her more than he'd expected.
There was something calming about her presence, something that made the solitude he had once craved feel a little emptier. It wasn't long before Maggie made it clear that she wasn't planning on leaving. The car, which had seemed like the only reason for her arrival, became less of an issue. Her reason for staying began to change, and Jacob could see it in her eyes. She wasn't just looking for a place to stay anymore. She was looking for something more. But what that something was, neither of them knew yet. As the days stretched into weeks, Jacob couldn't deny that his life had begun to change in ways he hadn't expected. Maggie was still here, and with each passing day he found himself growing accustomed to her presence. Psst. At first, it had been a small comfort to have someone else around, someone to share the quiet with. But now, it was more than that. Maggie had become a fixture in his world, and, whether he liked it or not, he had started to rely on her. It was the little things that stood out, like how she had a way of making the long days seem less lonely. She would hum softly as she worked, her voice carrying on the wind while she tended to the garden or took care of the animals. It wasn't anything extravagant, but it brought a sense of warmth to the ranch that had been missing for so long. Jacob had always prided himself on his independence, but didn't need anyone, didn't want anyone, to complicate his quiet existence. But Maggie was different. She was quiet too, but in a way that made it easy to share space with her.
He didn't have to entertain her with words.
She didn't expect anything more than what he was willing to give, and that made everything feel simpler.
One evening, as they sat down to another simple meal together, Maggie spoke up again.
Breath. She had been quieter than usual, her brow furrowed as if she was thinking over something important. Jacob noticed, but he didn't press her. They didn't speak much about personal things. It wasn't the way he was raised, and frankly, it wasn't something he was comfortable with. But tonight, Maggie's voice broke through the silence, and Jacob looked up, meeting her gaze for the first time in what felt like days. Her eyes were filled with something that Jacob couldn't quite place. a mixture of sadness, hope, and something else he hadn't seen before.
"I've been thinking," Maggie began, her hands resting on the table, her fingers nervously twisting the edge of her napkin, "about my life
Before I came here." Jacob set down his fork, a small knot forming in his stomach. He wasn't sure he wanted to hear about her past. It felt too complicated, too far removed from the quiet, uncomplicated life they were building here on the ranch. But he also knew that her staying here, living under the same roof, meant that her past was bound to come up sooner or later. "What about it?" he asked, trying to keep his voice steady. He didn't want to sound too interested, but he wasn't sure he could hide his curiosity. Maggie sighed, leaning back in her chair as if the weight of her thoughts was pressing down on her. "Before I came here, I was lost. I thought I had it all figured out. I had my life, my plans, my future. But then everything fell apart. I made mistakes. I made choices that led me down a path I never wanted to go down. And now I don't know where I fit anymore." Jacob remained silent, not sure how to respond. He wasn't one for deep conversations, but he could tell that Maggie needed to speak. She needed someone to listen, even if he wasn't sure he was the right person for the job. "I thought I could fix it, you know," she continued, her voice trembling slightly. "I thought that if I worked hard enough, if I put myself out there, I could make everything right again. But it's not that easy. People don't just forget what you've done, and I don't know how to fix it. I don't know how to fix myself." Jacob shifted in his seat, unsure of how to help. He wasn't a therapist, and he didn't have the answers to her problems. But he understood pain. He had his own scars, ones that ran deep and were just as difficult to face. He had never asked for help, and he didn't expect anyone to understand the struggles he'd faced over the years. Maybe that's why he had kept to himself for so long. "I'm not perfect either," Jacob said quietly, his voice rough from years of silence. "I've made my own mistakes. But I don't think it's about being perfect. It's about doing what you can with what you have." Maggie looked at him, her eyes searching his face as if looking for something, some kind of reassurance. "But what if that's not enough?" she asked softly. "What if I'm too broken to be fixed?" Jacob was quiet for a moment, thinking carefully about his response. He had never been good with words, but somehow this felt different. There was something about Maggie's vulnerability, her honesty, that made him want to say the right thing, if only he could figure out what that was. "I don't think anyone's too broken to be fixed," he said slowly. "Maybe you just need time." Time to heal. Time to figure things out. Things don't change overnight.
Maggie looked down at her hands, her fingers still nervously twisting the napkin in front of her. "I don't know if I have that kind of time," she whispered.
"I feel like I'm running out of chances." Jacob didn't know how to reassure her. He had never been the kind of person to offer empty promises. But something inside him urged him to do something, to say something that might give her hope. He wasn't sure if it would work, but he had to try. "Reyes, you're not running out of chances, Maggie," he said firmly. "You're here now. You're safe. You've got time." Maggie met his eyes again, her expression softening just a little. For a moment, the weight of her past seemed to lift, and she gave him a small, tentative smile. It wasn't much, but it was enough to make Jacob believe that maybe, just maybe, things could get better.
The next few days were a blur of routine.
Jacob focused on the ranch, and Maggie continued to help with the animals in the house. They didn't talk much more about the past, but it was clear that something had shifted between them. Maggie seemed a little lighter, a little more at ease. She still had her doubts, her fears, but there was a glimmer of hope in her eyes that hadn't been there before. And Jacob? He wasn't sure what was happening between them. Breath. All he knew was that the silence between them wasn't as heavy as it used to be. There was something in the air now, a sense of understanding that wasn't there before. And though he didn't know where it would lead, he found that he didn't mind having Maggie around. She wasn't just a stranger anymore. She was someone he could rely on, even if he wasn't ready to admit it to himself. As the days passed, Jacob began to notice small things that told him Maggie was settling in. She started to laugh more often, a soft, genuine laugh that echoed through the house like a breath of fresh air. She spent more time with the animals, getting to know them, talking to them as if they could understand her, and she had even started picking wildflowers from the fields to decorate the house, brightening up the place in ways Jacob hadn't thought possible. But there were still moments when Jacob caught a glimpse of the sadness in her eyes, the same sadness that had been there when she first arrived. He could see that she was trying to move forward, but he also knew that it wasn't that simple. Healing wasn't something that could be rushed. It took time, but he wasn't sure if he was ready to give her the time she needed, or if he was ready for the kind of change that seemed to be happening between them. Maggie's past wasn't something Jacob could fix. It wasn't something that could be easily erased with a few kind words. But he could offer her something, a sense of peace, a place to breathe, a chance to rebuild. Maybe that was enough for now.
It was a cool evening when Maggie's world shifted.
Bust. Jacob had been more distant the past few days. He was still working the ranch like usual, but there was a quiet tension between them that hadn't been there before. Maggie didn't quite understand what had changed, but she felt it. It was the kind of thing you couldn't name, but it was there, hanging between them like an unspoken question. It wasn't like Jacob to be quiet for long stretches, especially not with her. She had come to rely on the small moments they shared, those simple conversations that happened over dinner or while they worked together in the fields. But lately, Jacob's words had grown few. It wasn't that he was cold. No, it was more like he was lost in thought, retreating into himself in a way Maggie hadn't seen before. She had always known that Jacob wasn't one for talking about emotions, but this was different. She could feel the walls around him growing thicker. She wondered if it was because of her. If she was doing something wrong, Maggie didn't know if she was supposed to keep pressing or if she should just leave him to whatever was troubling him. She didn't want to force him to open up. She knew how that felt. But she also didn't want to stay in a silence that seemed to pull them further apart. One evening after dinner, Maggie could no longer hold back the question that had been gnawing at her all week. Breast. She stood in the doorway of the kitchen, watching Jacob as he sat by the fire, staring into the flames. His face was shadowed in the dim light, and Maggie could tell that something was on his mind. She hesitated for a moment, then took a deep breath and walked over to him. "Jacob," she said, her voice quieter than usual.
"What's going on? You've been so quiet lately."
Jacob didn't answer immediately. He just kept staring into the fire, his brow furrowed in thought. Maggie took a step closer, waiting, but he didn't seem to notice. She could feel the distance between them growing, like there was a wall she couldn't climb over.
"I'm just tired," Jacob finally said, his voice rough.
"There's a lot on my mind. You don't need to worry about it." Maggie frowned, not convinced. Well, she had learned by now that Jacob's "I'm fine" didn't always mean he was actually fine. He was a man of few words, but the way he spoke now, distant, closed off, told her that there was something more he wasn't saying. "You don't have to do everything alone, you know," she said softly, sitting down beside him. "I'm here, Jacob." "Ah, you don't have to shut me out.
He turned his head slightly, meeting her gaze for the first time that night.
His eyes were tired, but there was a flicker of something deeper there, a mixture of frustration, sadness, and a trace of something else. Maybe guilt.
Maggie couldn't quite place it, but she could feel the weight of it.
I'm not shutting you out, Jacob said, his voice low.
I just don't want to drag you into my mess.
You're already dealing with your own problems. You don't need mine, too.
Maggie's heart ached at his words. She had come to care for him in a way she hadn't expected.
She didn't want him to feel like he had to carry everything alone, especially not when she was right here. She had her own past, her own scars, but maybe, just maybe, they could help each other heal.
It wasn't about fixing everything at once. It was about being there for both of them.
You don't have to carry it all by yourself, she said again, more firmly this time. I'm not going anywhere, Jacob. Whatever you're dealing with, you don't have to do it alone. Jacob's face softened just a little, but he still didn't say anything. He seemed to be wrestling with something inside, and Maggie could see the struggle in the way his shoulders tensed. She wasn't sure if he would ever open up to her the way she needed him to, but she couldn't just sit back and watch him bury everything inside.
I don't know how to ask for help, Jacob admitted finally, his voice barely above a whisper.
Brance, I've been on my own for so long, I don't know any other way. Maggie felt a pang in her chest at his words. She knew that feeling all too well. The fear of relying on someone else. The fear that asking for help would make you weak or burden the other person. But she also knew that it wasn't weakness. It was strength. And Jacob, despite everything, was strong. He had just forgotten how to trust others with his pain. You don't have to be perfect, Maggie said gently, placing a hand on his. It's okay to need someone, Jacob.
I'm not going to judge you. I just want to help.
Jacob's eyes flickered to her hand, and for a moment he didn't pull away. He just looked at it, as if unsure of what to do. Maggie held her breath, hoping that he would finally let down his guard. Just a little. She wanted to help him.
She wanted to show him that it was okay to open up, that it wasn't a burden to share his troubles.
I'm not good at this, Jacob said, his voice rough again.
I'm not good at letting people in.
Maggie smiled softly, understanding. No one is, but we don't have to do it perfectly. We just have to try. The silence stretched between them, thick and heavy, but not uncomfortable. It was a silence full of understanding, full of unspoken promises. Jacob was still unsure, still hesitant, but Maggie could tell that something had shifted. Maybe it was the first step. Maybe it wasn't the answer he had been looking for, but it was something. And it was enough for now. The days after that night felt different. Jacob wasn't suddenly opening up, but there was a small change in the way they interacted. He still kept to himself, but Maggie noticed that he was a little less guarded, a little more willing to let her in. They didn't talk about his troubles directly, but she could see that the weight was lighter somehow. Maybe, just maybe, he was starting to believe that he didn't have to carry it all alone.
And Maggie?
But she wasn't sure if she was ready for everything that Jacob was holding back. But she had learned something important. She didn't need him to be perfect. She didn't need him to have all the answers. She just needed him to trust her, even if it was just a little. And maybe, just maybe, they could figure it out together. The days turned into weeks, and slowly Jacob began to let her in a little more. He didn't talk about his past, but he didn't shut her out completely either. And that was enough for Maggie, for now. She knew that healing didn't happen overnight, but she was willing to be patient, to give him the time he needed. She knew she couldn't fix everything, but she was determined to help him carry it.
As the sun began to set each evening, casting long shadows over the ranch, Maggie felt a quiet sense of hope growing inside her. There was still so much unknown between them. Still so much that neither of them had said, but for the first time in a long while she felt like maybe, just maybe, things would get better.
It was a few months later, and the ranch had settled into a routine that felt comfortable.
Jacob and Maggie had developed a rhythm, one that worked for both of them. The long hours on the ranch kept them busy, but there was something peaceful about it. The work wasn't easy, but it was fulfilling, and it was quiet. No questions, no expectations. Breaths, just the land, the cattle, and each other. For Maggie, this was the kind of life she had needed. The chaos of her past seemed to fade with every passing day. The ranch was an escape, a place where she didn't have to worry about the mistakes she had made before, where she could just be. But even in the peace of the ranch, there were moments when the past crept back into her mind, moments when she couldn't shake the memories that haunted her. And Jacob, despite everything, had become someone she relied on. Someone who made those dark thoughts feel just a little less heavy. But she knew there was still something missing. Jacob still held part of himself back, despite the progress they had made. He wasn't as closed off as he had been when she first arrived, but there were still pieces of him that he hadn't shared. He hadn't talked much about his life before the ranch, about his family, or about the things that had shaped him into the man he was. Maggie had learned to accept his silence, but there were days when she couldn't help but wonder what he was hiding. One evening, as they were finishing up their work for the day, Maggie finally gathered the courage to ask the question that had been on her mind for so long. They were sitting outside on the porch, the cool evening air making the fading sunlight feel just a little bit more special. Jacob had taken off his boots and was sitting back in his chair, eyes on the horizon. Maggie sat across from him, watching him closely, wondering if tonight might be the night when he would finally open up to her. "Jacob," she said softly, her voice carrying in the stillness of the evening.
"Can I ask you something?" Jacob glanced at her, his expression unreadable. "What is it?" His voice was calm, but there was something in his eyes that told Maggie he wasn't sure he wanted to hear her question.
He'd never been one to talk about the past, but she couldn't shake the feeling that he needed to. "Why did you choose this life?" Maggie asked, her voice quiet but steady. "I mean, you could have done anything. Why the ranch? Why stay out here alone?" Jacob was silent for a moment, the question clearly weighing on him. Maggie could see the tension in his shoulders, the way his hand gripped the arm of his chair just a little tighter. He hadn't expected her to ask that, but Maggie had a feeling it was a question that had been lingering in his mind for a long time.
I don't know,
he finally said, his voice low. "It's not like I had a choice. It's just what I knew. It's where I ended up." Maggie could tell that was only part of the story. First, Jacob was holding back, just as he always did. But something in his voice, something in the way he said those words, made her believe that there was more to it. But something he wasn't ready to share. She didn't press him, not yet. But she made a mental note to give him time. She could feel that he was getting closer to letting go of whatever it was he was holding inside. A few days later, Maggie found herself alone in the barn, cleaning out the hayloft. The afternoon sun was warm, and the barn smelled of fresh straw and wood base. She liked the solitude of the barn, the quiet work of caring for the animals. It was a moment of peace she had come to cherish. As she worked, she found herself thinking more about Jacob's response. His words kept replaying in her mind. "It's where I ended up. What did that mean?" Her thoughts were interrupted when she heard the sound of footsteps behind her.
She turned to see Jacob standing in the doorway of the barn, watching her quietly. He was leaning against the frame, arms crossed, looking as though he was about to say something but not quite sure how to begin. "Maggie," he said, his voice soft, "I need to tell you something." Maggie's heart skipped a beat. She could feel the tension in the air, the weight of the moment. This was it. The moment when Jacob would finally share the part of himself he had been keeping locked away. She set the rake down and walked toward him, her heart pounding in her chest. "Jacob, you don't have to." "No," he interrupted gently. "I do."
I've been carrying this for a long time, and I can't keep it inside anymore. Maggie nodded, unsure of what he was about to say, but ready to listen.
She could feel her breath catch in her throat as Jacob stepped forward, his gaze fixed on the floor for a moment. He was quiet for a long time, as if searching for the right words. When he finally spoke, his voice was steady, but there was a depth to it that Maggie hadn't heard before. "When I was younger," Jacob began, his voice low but clear, "I had a family, a mother, a father. They were good people. We had a small farm back then. I loved it. I loved the work, the land. I thought I was going to take over the farm one day, just like my father did. But life doesn't always go the way you expect." He paused, his eyes distant as he relived the memories in his mind. Maggie didn't interrupt. She just listened, her heart heavy with the weight of his words. "My father got sick when I was a teenager," Jacob continued, his voice quiet. "He was never the same after that. My mother tried to take care of him, but it was too much for her. They both got worse, and I had to take over the farm."
I had to grow up faster than I ever expected. Maggie's chest tightened as she listened.
Grasps. She had no idea that Jacob had gone through something so difficult. When they both passed, Jacob went on, his voice trembling just slightly. "I didn't know what to do. I couldn't stay on the farm. It felt wrong. It was like everything had been taken from me. So I left. I came out here, to this ranch, and I've been here ever since. I thought if I could just work, if I could just keep moving, I wouldn't have to think about everything I lost. But it never goes away." Maggie's eyes filled with sympathy, her heart breaking for him. She could see now why Jacob had closed himself off. He had lost everything, his family, his home, and in the wake of that loss he had built these walls around himself. But hearing him say it out loud, hearing the pain in his voice, he had Maggie realize just how much he had carried alone for all these years.
"I'm sorry, Jacob," Maggie whispered, her voice soft with emotion.
Breaths. "I had no idea. I wish I could have been there for you." Jacob shook his head, his eyes meeting hers.
You didn't know. But that's why I'm telling you now.
I don't want to keep this inside anymore. I want to start moving forward. I don't want to be stuck in the past forever. Maggie reached out, her hand gently resting on his. "You don't have to do it alone. I'm here, Jacob." "Whatever you need, I'm here." Jacob's gaze softened, and for the first time Maggie saw a flicker of hope in his eyes. Maybe, just maybe, he was starting to believe that he didn't have to carry all of this alone. Maybe he was starting to trust her. The silence that followed wasn't awkward. It was a quiet understanding, a shared moment that marked a turning point in their relationship. Jacob had finally opened up, and Maggie felt a sense of relief wash over her. She had known that there was more to his story, more to the man who had been so quiet and withdrawn, but hearing it from him, Hearing his pain and his vulnerability made her realize just how much he had endured. It wasn't the end of the journey, not by a long shot, but it was a beginning. A beginning of healing, of moving forward, and of facing the past together. Jacob wasn't alone anymore. The ranch, despite its quiet simplicity, had become a place of healing for both Jacob and Maggie. The hard work, the long hours, the dusty afternoons spent in the fields. It all became a kind of therapy, a way for them to focus on something other than the weight they both carried. But Jacob had opened up about his past, and Maggie had shared her fears, her regrets. But now, there was something different in the air. The quiet between them had evolved. There was an understanding now, a deep connection that had grown out of the time they had spent together. They weren't the same people they had been when they first met. Maggie had always struggled with the idea of being alone. She'd spent years convincing herself that she didn't need anyone, that she could stand on her own.
But as she worked alongside Jacob on the ranch, she began to see that it wasn't about standing alone. It was about standing together.
And though Jacob had been through so much, though he had carried his pain in silence for so long, she could see now that they were stronger when they shared the load. But there were still moments of doubt that crept into her mind. Maggie knew that she had a lot of healing to do. Her past wasn't something that could be forgotten, and she wasn't naive enough to think that everything would be perfect just because they had found something special in each other. Breath. She still had days when the weight of it all felt unbearable, when the guilt from her past would return, whispering in her ear, reminding her of the mistakes she had made. Jacob, too, had his moments. The ranch was still a place of refuge, but there were nights when Maggie could see the shadows in his eyes, the old pain that never quite disappeared. She understood that he wasn't going to wake up one day and magically be healed.
Healing wasn't a straight path, it was a journey, full of twists and turns, moments of progress and setbacks. But for the first time in a long while, Maggie felt like she was moving forward.
She wasn't the same woman who had arrived at the ranch months ago, broken and lost. She had found something here, something more important than she had ever imagined. Peace. A sense of belonging. And with Jacob by her side, there was a new kind of hope in her heart. It was early one morning when the change came. Jacob had been up before dawn, as he always did, taking care of the animals and making sure everything was in order. Maggie had learned to rise with the sun, and when she stepped out onto the porch that morning, she was greeted by the familiar, calm silence of the ranch. The birds were singing, the wind rustling through the trees. It was a peaceful, perfect morning. Jacob was standing by the fence, his back to her, watching the cattle graze in the early light. Breath. He looked content, something Maggie hadn't seen in a while. She walked over to him, slowly, unsure of what to say, but knowing that something was different. She could feel it in the way the air seemed to shimmer with possibility.
"Good morning," she said softly, stepping up beside him.
Jacob turned to look at her, and for a moment, neither of them spoke. There was something unspoken between them, something that had grown in the quiet moments they shared. Maggie looked at him, her heart full, and without thinking she reached out and took his hand, but Jacob didn't pull away. Instead, he looked at her with a softness in his eyes that made her chest tighten.
It wasn't the same as before. This wasn't just the silence of two people who had become used to each other. This was something more.
A quiet understanding that had been built on time, on shared experiences, and on the moments when they had both been vulnerable with each other.
"I've been thinking," Jacob said after a long pause, his voice low but steady.
About us! Maggie's heart skipped a beat. What about us? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. He turned to face her fully, his hand still holding hers. "I never thought I could let anyone in again. Not after everything that happened. I've spent so many years alone convincing myself that it was better that way. But now I realize I don't want to be alone anymore." Maggie felt her breath catch in her throat. She had never heard Jacob say anything like that before. He had always been quiet about his feelings, guarded with his words, but now there was something in his voice, something real and raw that made her heart ache with emotion. "I don't want to be alone either," Maggie said, her voice trembling slightly. "Not anymore." For a moment they stood there, hand in hand, looking out at the land before them. It was a simple moment, but it meant everything. In that moment, everything felt right. Round in desperation. They didn't need to say anything more. They didn't need to make promises or rush into anything. Breath. All they needed was to be there for each other, to understand that their journey wasn't over. It was just beginning. As the days went on, things changed, but not in the way Maggie had expected. Pesh. There was no sudden revelation, no grand gesture, but the small moments, those moments of quiet connection, of shared laughter, of working side by side, became more meaningful. They began to build a life together, a life that was simple but full of purpose. It wasn't perfect, but it was real. One afternoon, Jacob surprised Maggie by taking her to the edge of the property. It was a place she had never been before, a small hill that overlooked the entire ranch. The sun was beginning to set, casting a warm golden glow over the land.
"I thought you might like to see it from here," Jacob said, standing beside her. Maggie looked out at the view, her heart swelling with emotion.
It was beautiful. The ranch stretched out before them, the cattle grazing peacefully, the trees swaying in the breeze. It was a life that she never could have imagined for herself. A life that felt right. A life that felt like home. "I love it here," she said quietly, her voice full of wonder. "I never thought I'd find a place like this." Jacob smiled, his gaze softening. "I never thought I'd find someone like you." Maggie turned to face him, her heart beating faster. She saw the sincerity in his eyes, the warmth that had grown between them. It wasn't just the land that made her feel at home. It was Jacob. And in that moment, she realized that she didn't need to have all the answers. She didn't need to know what the future held. All she needed was to be here, in this moment, with him. Jacob reached out, gently brushing a strand of hair from her face.
"I don't have all the answers either," he said quietly.
"But I know that I want to be here, with you."
Maggie smiled, her heart full. She had come to the ranch looking for an escape, looking for peace.
What she found instead was something even more precious. A connection. A partnership. Place where she could finally feel at home. Not just with the land, but with someone who understood her, who accepted her for who she was. As the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky with shades of pink and orange, Jacob and Maggie stood together hand in hand. The world felt right. Their journey wasn't over, but it had come a long way. They had found something that neither of them had expected, but both of them needed. And as they looked out at the land before them, they knew that no matter what challenges lay ahead, they would face them together. And that, for the first time in a long while, felt like enough.